here we are. Welcome, YouTube family. The sound might be a little bit different today. Our internet has already been disconnected as we moved to the new location, so I wasn't able to use my usual platform to record. So the video and sound may be a bit off, and I apologize. But let's go ahead and take another deep breath. It's a winter wonderland outside, actually. So that's a joy. But what's beautiful about today is this is the final sermon and community gathering we're going to have in the Zen Cowboy location here in downtown Bayfield before we move to our new location, which is just about 6 miles towards Pagosa Springs from here in Bayfield to a lovely lodge. And so we're really excited to have this new location that's a bit bigger and will allow us to house a lot more community events. But we've been talking about, and it's really cool because today is the final tenet of Living Peace that we're covering after 2 months of covering these, and it's release self. And so it's just kind of a beautiful conclusion, and it's funny how it all came together like that. Mm-hmm. And so let me go ahead and read our usual introduction for the code. In Dunisha, the Living Peace Code is our anchor for clarity, presence, and peace. No matter what circumstances arise in our life, we can always return to the code and receive its stabilizing influence. So today I'm going to teach about release of self, and then we're going to do a recap on the 9 tenets and then the first 3 practices. So it's just kind of a cool coming together bit that we'll be doing. But for those of you who have your handout, you can go ahead and write this in first. So it's going to be release attachments to the self. Release attachments to the self. And the previous one that we covered last week was release knowing, and before that was release the mundane. So what I love about these final 3 tenets of the 9 and Living Peace is that it really challenges us. The first 3 are all about self-mastery. The next 3 are all about the illusory nature of our perceptions. And then the final 3 are really, it's where things get even a little bit more intense, where they really bring in the wisdom of impermanence and how all things that we're super attached to can ultimately lead us into suffering. And so that's why we release our attachments to the mundane world, the things that are intangible physically, and then we release our attachments to the things that we believe to be true, the knowledge aspect, because even knowledge can sometimes become a trap. What was it? My favorite quote was, never mistake the awareness or knowledge of something for truth or wisdom. That's what we said last week. Never mistake the awareness or knowledge of something for hard truth or wisdom. Because sometimes we'll say, oh yeah, I know that already. But then are we actually doing it? Are we actually living it? So sometimes knowledge can definitely be a trap for us, and it justifies our ego's inflation or deflation. And then release self. One of my favorite quotes from Living Peace is, we cannot release ourselves until we know ourselves, which is a bit of a paradox because last week was all about release knowing, but really ultimately these first 8 tenets is really gaining the understanding of our core wounds, of our egoic nature, of how we get triggered and how we might react to life. And then finally, when we have that deep understanding, we can come to the final tenet of release self to really relinquish this identity. Because ultimately what gets us into, quote, trouble is this identity that we have. It's the aspect of ourselves that gets offended by life. It gets triggered. And a lot of times we'll walk into situations with our own agenda. And when we have our own agenda, we're not always capable of hearing other people's pain and not able to hold space for them. And then you can go ahead and write this down. The 2 arts that we're going to talk about today is the art of love and the art of resurgence. The art of love and the art of resurgence. And I'm going to go ahead and read a couple chapters from my book, Living Peace, real quick, because it really eloquently captures the essence here. And it will keep me from repeating myself as much. So let's see, we're going to turn to page 168, I believe. Yes. The paradox of self-actualization and release. As mentioned in the flashback story, we must know ourselves before we can release ourselves, which may seem a bit paradoxical since the previous tenet was release knowing. The first 7 tenets were about learning and understanding ourselves, and the 8th was about releasing said knowing. So we can finally step into the tenet of release self. Each tenet beautifully builds on top of the previous one, creating a stable foundation and structure in which we may achieve inner peace and expand states of consciousness. And yet release self reminds us that this journey is not about us, nor has it ever been. We start the inner peace journey under the delusional goal of achieving inner peace for our own relief and well-being, or for enlightenment. However, when we finally get to the end, which is never truly the end, our delusion of separation is shattered. We realize that our lives are but a collection of droplets in a cosmic ocean, or, for the spiritually minded, we are a gathering of souls that make up the universe. The ocean cannot exist without each droplet, just as we cannot exist without each other. Everything and everyone is interconnected. Previously, we believed we were all separate, yet it is our combined consciousness that creates the world we see and enjoy, or suffer from. It is our choice to create and recreate what we experience through our 6 senses, and now we have the tools to alleviate not only our suffering, but the collective suffering of those on our planet, through first embodying peace and then teaching peace. When people try to help the world first without releasing self, their assistance is often riddled with selfishness and egocentric thinking. Over-sympathizing is often connected with feelings of pity or of bad or less fortunate. Without our new awareness, we slip into the well-meaning judgments of the savior complex or controlling complex. Sometimes our motivation to help may even arise out of our feelings of discomfort or guilt. By, quote, helping, we feel gratified and pat ourselves on the back for a job well done and being a good person who gives back, only to return to our mundane dramas and personal bubbles, completely forgetting about the rest of the world and its problems until next time we feel that guilt or obligation. A very common unhelpful helping takes place every day in many relationships and marriages. We hear our loved ones complaining about something, and in, quote, feeling bad for them, we immediately chime in with solutions. Shortly thereafter, our loved one reacts by saying, "You're not listening," or "You don't understand." Because we're well-meaning or just trying to help, we feel lost and confused. We act on what we think is in their best interest, instead of taking the time to step out of our own opinions and ask them what they need in the moment, or what they would like help with later on. Practicing this kind of communication allows us to see the world not through our eyes, but through the eyes of the people we care about and are trying to assist. Please always remember that. Let me repeat that. We act on what we think is in their best interest, instead of taking the time to step out of our own opinions and ask them what they need in that moment. That's powerful, isn't it? Release self allows us to break the mirror so we no longer see reflections of ourselves in everyone. Instead, we begin to see each individual as an individual without comparisons and biases that cloud our own vision. In this way, we gain the ability to see life through the eyes of others and cease trying to change or create the world in our own image. Ooh, listen to that one. Let's repeat that. We cease trying to change or create the world in our own image. This unconditional freedom is the very nature of love, and what some may even call divine. So right there, what I just shared was a lot of juice, and it really encaptures the essence of Dunisha and living peace. I can't remember who it was. It might have been Thomas Merton, who is a Christian mystic who later in life really started getting into Zen. But he said something along the lines of, a lot of people pray to a God that they created in their own image. And a lot of us, politically, religiously, culturally, we really do see life through an image or a mirror of our own creation. And it's very damaging because we create a bubble of self-justification of our own righteousness, of our own pity, of our own suffering, of our own anger, whatever it might be. And all you have to do is literally, it's what I love with Dunisha is that we really do our best. We of course have our preferences, but in Dunisha, when we wear these robes, we really try to relinquish all political ideology, and we try to take in information from all sources. And when you relinquish your identity when it comes to politics or even religion, it's really revealing because you're able to listen to all sides and you're able to receive all information. And then you start to see how what's fascinating, where everyone is getting stuck in their own personal agendas and they're not able to build bridges of communication and hear each other. And it's very difficult to hold space for that. And as therapists, we have to, especially if you work with couples, because they each have their own, even on a micro level, even in people in their own household, have their own different agendas and their own perceptions. But what's fascinating is there always is a universal truth and a universal desire to be seen, heard, acknowledged. And what we talked about last week was almost every single person on this planet, let me not make a generalization. Nearly every person I've ever worked with, and the hot seat, on the hot chair over there, almost everyone has always expressed that they feel unappreciated. That's like a common denominator in all of us. So we see that on a micro level, and you see that on a macro level. And so when we're able to step out of our own agenda with released self, we start to be able to see the world through the lens of other people. It's never perfect because, again, we can never fully relinquish our identity because we're kind of in this meat suit and in this unique brain that's had certain experiences. But when you really make that your top priority, it really does alleviate a lot of the judgments and biases that normally we would be taking with us into the situations. Does that make sense? So it's quite profound. And that's why every identifying factor that we have within ourselves in Dunisha, when we get to the ninth tenet, we focus on releasing. It doesn't mean we may not pick it up later on, but for me, it would be releasing this idea of my age, releasing this idea of being a man, releasing the idea of being gay, even releasing my attachments if I'm sometimes feeling I'm a bit more Taoist one day or Buddhist one day or pagan one day. Because sometimes I might get a little too into that. And then the moment I get a little too comfortable into that, then I start making comparisons from the other spiritual path I don't prefer. And then you start to create a little bit of friction there. But then when I soften and relinquish that and then relax into, is the word ambiguity? Someone say that.
Ambiguity. Ambiguity.
Ambiguity.
No, I can't. I
know.
Ambiguity.
Thank you, that word. It's really, really quite lovely. And of course we do use a word Dunisha, or living peace, and sometimes Zen, to give life to what we're practicing. But that's the difficult aspect of human nature, is that sometimes we need words to help understand what's going on. But it doesn't mean we use it in a dogmatic sense to where we create separation between ourselves and others. Does that make sense? So it's quite delicious, quite nutritious. So let's breathe that in. So what's beautiful is at the end of those handful of paragraphs I read, it said, finally we're coming to the essence of love. Isn't it interesting that this whole damn journey, I really haven't brought up love much until now. It's always been peace this, peace that, peace this, peace that. And there's a reason for that. And many of you have heard me talk about this before, but a lot of times love is full of ego. It's full of attachment. And we use our loving attachment, to justify our non-alignment. We're choking someone and yelling at them saying, it's because I love you, that's why I'm doing this. And that's not love, that's fear, that's attachment. When we develop loving attachments towards people and they start to do behavior that is out of our desire, it makes us lose our peace. We use it as justification to lose our peace. And so instead of remaining in compassion and understanding, we just throw that out the window and we get into controlling behavior. Who's ever tried to control someone before? Or we get into judgmental behavior or passive aggressive behavior. There's so many things that manifest. But when you put peace before love, you actually come to know unconditional love. When you put peace before love, you start to actually enter into unconditional love. I often say the quote from Living Peace is, unconditional love is the outward or outer expression of inner peace. Unconditional love is the outer expression of inner peace. And all you have to do is look back, either presently in your life, or look back to the times when you may have been a bit more chaotic in your behaviors. And I can certainly attest that even though I've said I love people before, my actions were not loving, and my thoughts were not loving, and they were actually more fear-based, full of agenda. I wanted something. I wanted reality to look a certain way. So I was very much attached to an outcome, and if I did not get said outcome, my behavior towards them would change. And that's not unconditional. That's called conditional. And so in Living Peace and Dunisha, we spend so much time, the first 8 tenets, rooting out our shit so that even when life throws triggers at us or relationships fall apart, or just we completely go through an identity crisis. Maybe we lost our job that we had for 40 years, and that was a huge part of our identity. We are still able to show up and look at the impermanence and not be majorly swayed by it. Does that make sense? So it's almost like we become a font, a vessel, an essence of peace and love. We give it unconditionally. And then I'm not going to go too much into this, but it's interesting. Law of attraction, universal laws. Because you are embodying it, you don't need to no longer worry about grasping for it around you. That was a big thing I had to change within myself, because I mentioned how everyone wants to feel appreciated, but another form of that is we all want to feel acknowledged and validated, right? And so when you let go of that agenda of needing to be acknowledged and validated all the time, and you just start to be present for other people, what you've done is you fully have gotten to that point of releasing self, because you've understood yourself in the areas that you've got hooked before. And now you can start showing up and being that selfless vessel of which most religions have archetypes of, such as Jesus, such as Buddha, right? That is often the goal of this selfless service. But we cannot get to selfless service until we fully understand ourselves, so that we can then release ourselves. Does that make sense? And that's what this journey is. I'm not going to say it's going to lead to I don't even know what the fuck enlightenment means. It's in my book. It's like Living Peace, Essential Teachings for Enlightenment in the 21st Century. But again, enlightenment to me more means inner peace, consistency, stabilization between the mind, body, heart harmony. But this idea of ending, getting out of the cycle of samsara and you're becoming enlightened, I don't know what fucking happens after we die, and I don't know what happens beforehand. And I never feel comfortable trying to claim it, because we're in these human bodies, and to claim the unknowable as a hard truth, we're starting to fall into the 3 illusions. Ignorance is an illusion, we seek understanding. And I definitely have felt things that are mystical, that might have felt like they came from before, might come after, but we never claim that as a hard truth, because what that does is you lay a brick, and then you lay another brick, then you lay another brick, and all of a sudden you've built a house on an unsturdy foundation that is built more off of an idea versus a tangible truth. And that's where you get people justifying, again, going back to justifying non-alignment behavior and non-peaceful behavior based off of foundations that seem to be true, that are based off of facts, such as anytime we've used religious dogma that's attached to the afterlife to justify our causing harm to someone right here, right now. Does that make sense? And that's the part that gets a little bit finicky when we get so attached to ideas and our identities, political or religious or cultural, and that we sometimes stop giving that unconditional love or that unconditional peace to people, or that human dignity, the grace, the compassion, the kindness, because we're so caught up in an ideal. Does that make sense? And so what I love about Living Peace is that it rips it all apart. If you really take each tenet step by step, you'll naturally be ready to release self when you get to the end. And that's what I always love to do, is that if I'm suffering, struggling with something, I'll put a little thing that I'm chewing on, like a little morsel, up here through the grinder of Living Peace. And then it goes down, and by the time it comes out, you often can find the delusion, the attachment. And a lot of times it's of our own making, it's of our own choosing. We've attached to some idea, to some identity that's actually impermanent. Pretty powerful stuff, isn't it? So let's take a deep breath. We have like 10 minutes left, but it's already 2 o'clock. Okay. Okay, people, buckle up. We're going to do our quiz. But first, actually, I need to write a few more things down. So let's go ahead and do the check-in. The check-in is who am I, and then what is I? Who am I? What is I? And so I love these questions. They're very Zen questions. Who am I and what am I? Or, one of a koan is, what was your face before you were born? That's a Zen koan. A Zen koan is something that you ask a student that has no answer, and they just go insane trying to think about all the ways to answer it. But the purpose is to break apart notions, break apart ideas. And so who am I? You really can't answer that, because you can give all the mundane answers to that. You can give all these identities, your physicality, your accomplishments, the belief systems you might adhere to and attach to. But is that really you? The answer is no, because we're all impermanent beings. And so it's one of those half-truths. It's a this and that. Obviously, I'm Alaric Hutchinson, and I teach Zen, and I'm a life coach. I teach Dunisha. We have this place. I'm married to this handsome fella over here. We're wearing robes, which freaks some people out, and that's okay. And all of that is true, but it's also not true. And what I love about that is recognizing the half-truth nature of things that we claim is it softens us. It makes it to where we're more receptive to other people, and we don't take such hard stances on things, because when we take such hard stances on things, generally it stops learning from occurring on the other side anyway, and it leads to further conflict. And so we teach through grace, we teach through peace, we teach through embodiment. Rather than yelling at the world to change in a way that's more peaceful, we simply work on embodying peace and then interacting with people in a peaceful way. And we find that that is so much more conducive to benefiting others versus having this strong agenda that we lose our inner peace over. Who's ever felt that way before? And then the practice is very basic. It's the resurgence. It's returning to the code. The practice is returning to the code. So we already mentioned the art of love, which is delicious because in our peace we learn to love. But the second art is the art of resurgence, and what that means is that you're coming back around. There's a resurgence of the teachings. It's not a ladder. It's not linear. It's a circle. So think of after you've been through this, you went through a linear fashion, but now all of a sudden the teachings transform and they're in a circle. And you're now able to activate them each daily rather than working on one at a time. And so we return to mastery of thought and we repeat the cycle again. Because who's ever gone through a program or went to school and you completed the shit, but then you forget because you don't necessarily use it. And the same is true for this. And I've met many students and clients and even just members, community members over the years who they love this stuff. They were so enthralled by it. But then they get to the end and they're just like, well, that was nice. They close the book and they're just like, I learned some stuff. They put it down and then they go back to their daily life. And then they forget. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's really no judgment to that whatsoever. But we also notice that our ego starts to creep back in. Our habitual patterns that may be unhealthy or not serving us creep back in. We notice our judgments start to creep back in. This is even true for me when I'm not practicing daily. I always practice somewhat daily, but I may not be returning to the teachings in the same fashion daily. And so that's why this is a lifestyle and not just a certification program. So, the 3 masteries, we can shout them out to me. What are the first 3 masteries? This is fill in the blank. Mastery of what? Who remembers?
Am I not allowed?
No.
Okay, I'm not allowed.
Well, it's thought, emotion, and
Thought, impulse, emotion.
impulse, that's it.
Very good.
Impulse.
Very good. So mastery of thought, impulse, emotion. Anyone remember the illusions, the 3 illusions?
Duality, chaos.
Backwards, good.
No.
Excellent. So it's going to be ignorance, chaos, and duality. See, this is why it's so wonderful to do this. Back in Arizona, I was notorious for like pop quizzing my students. Yeah.
We got quizzed quite a bit.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. Ignorance, chaos, duality. And then we seek. Anyone remember what we seek?
Transcendence.
Perfect. That's the 3rd one. Yep. Transcendence. What's the 1st and 2nd? The opposite of ignorance is... At least
harmony. Well, the harmony is one of them.
Harmony is the opposite of chaos for us, yeah. And then understanding is the opposite of ignorance.
Yes.
So ignorance is an illusion, we seek understanding. Chaos is an illusion, we seek harmony. Duality is an illusion, we seek transcendence. So really, when it says by is an illusion, we're just recognizing the illusory nature of these things. And then we're setting the intention to seek understanding, harmony, and transcendence. And again, we have sermons on all these that you can go back to and watch. And then who remembers, obviously the final one is what? Release. Thank you. Self. And then what were the first 2? Release.
The mundane.
Mundane, and then release.
The knowing.
Knowing. Fantastic. So we have release mundane, release knowing, and release self. Put all these together and you got the Live in Peace Code, which is fantastic. And then you have the 3 practices at the bottom, which again you can find either in, I've talked about these a bit in various sermons, and they're in the book really detailed nicely. The first practice is the file exchange, recognizing the conscious and subconscious mind. Some people might call it autosuggestion or positive affirmation work, but we definitely take it to a different level that's sometimes more effective for people to utilize. Practice 2 is PPR, pause, process, and respond, which is a student favorite. Anytime we feel triggered by life, do we take a pause by breathing, processing the situation, which normally processing, you can call to mind the little Alaric in your mind that says, there's never a reason good enough to act out of alignment with peace. And then you respond to the situation rather than react to the situation. Really keywords there, reaction versus response versus reaction. And then finally we have practice 3, which is wave surfing. Emotional wave surfing. Anytime we feel emotion arising within us, we recognize that we recognize its impermanent nature. That is just a temporary manifestation of something that's coming on. And it often ties into the thought that we're thinking or belief system that we're chewing on. And when you can recognize it, you can learn to surf the emotions rather than being consumed by them, which we do a lot in our relationship and marriage, to where anytime I feel triggered by anything, I'm able to speak very calmly and very clearly through it. While years ago, I would have just been like, where you just get into anxiety or panic, depression, grief, or anger, and you're not able to speak clearly because you're not recognizing the impermanent nature of the emotion. So now when I feel emotion, even if it's negative, I'm just like, well, isn't that interesting? I am feeling this. I'm feeling sadness or anger or frustration right now versus I'm angry, I'm sad. We're not claiming it. We're recognizing that it's manifesting, it's surfacing in our body. So when you put the file exchange, PPR, and wave surfing together, you've got a powerful combination of tools to utilize as you go throughout your daily life and in your human interactions versus your non-human. No. So let's breathe that in. We'll go ahead and wrap it up. Main key things to remember here is that unconditional love is the outward expression of inner peace, and to release ourselves, we must know ourselves and really take the time to understand our ins and outs, leaning into our pain, leaning into our discomfort, leaning into our addictions and our reactive tendencies, and all the ways in which we identify ourselves that really separate ourselves from other people in the world. And as we work towards that through the Living Peace Code, we come to that point of resurgence where we repeat the cycle again and we create a beautiful lifestyle around this, which eventually next year I'm going to come out with my second book, Living Earth, which is the spirituality of Dunisha, whereas this was the philosophy of Dunisha. Anyone from any walk of life can apply this to their life, whereas the spirituality of Dunisha gives more of a ritualistic tendency where we're honoring the seasons, we're honoring the earth, we're honoring the cycles of the moon as opportunities to reconnect within ourselves, and looking at the natural world for its wisdom and how it ties into this. And so it's really quite lovely, and they're going to be very complementary. But until that time comes, we have plenty to do and plenty to work on. So as always, I want to thank everyone for taking the time to listen, and we have received some donations online, which we are so grateful for. Thank you for those of you who've taken the time to go online and donate. And links are down below for anyone else that may have been interested in but don't know how to. And we'll see you in our new location next week. And I hope the sound wasn't too finicky today, and I know there was a bit of blur action going on, but I appreciate you guys for hanging in there. Till next time, blessed be.